right, fifth grade, back to talking about the colonies and social studies. We're going to talk about two different groups of people that lived in the colonies, okay? So there's the people that live there, we call them the colonists, right? Colonists, the people that kind of made up that group. There's a lot of different kinds of people, but mostly free people and slaves, okay? Free people and slaves. Now, out of the free people that lived in the colonies, we can break those down into two more groups, okay? And those are the Patriots and the Loyalists. All right, so at this time, if you remember, the person who was in charge of the colonies, here they are. The person who was in charge of these 13 colonies is the King of England, all right, on the other side of the ocean. So these two groups of people, the Patriots and the Loyalists, they are the two groups that make up the colonists in our country, okay? Before the United States ever happened, but these are the two groups. Okay? Now today what we are going to do is talk a little bit about those two groups, see what they had that were different about them. So out here on the outsides of these diagrams here, and then what was common, what was similar between those two. Okay, this diagram here, this Venn diagram, should not be new to you. We did this in holes earlier in the year. I guarantee that you filled out Venn diagrams before. That's what we're going to do today. Okay, so what we're going to do first is talk about Patriots. Okay, and I'm talking about Patriots back in the colonial times in the colonies, not the football team. Okay, so the first thing about the Patriots that is important, I'm going to capitalize this, they really disliked the king. Okay, they really disliked the king. They thought the king was some fancy guy who had no idea what they were going through, who didn't care about them, who thought that the king was just the worst. He was taxing them for no reason. He was taxing them, and they didn't even live by the king. They thought it was super unfair. They disliked the king. All right, they really disliked the king. Another thing about the Patriots, they wanted to be their own country. Okay, so they did not like being part of England anymore. All right, so they disliked the king. They wanted to start their own country. They did not want to have anything to do with that king. Okay, that king was not their own. They wanted their own leader. Okay. And the last thing about the Patriots here that's very important, started many protests. Okay, so this group started a lot of protests saying, hey, everybody, get out of your homes, get off your behinds, and let's protest the king. He is the worst. We dislike him. We need to start our own country. We're going to start some protests. All right, so the Patriots were the ones who disliked the king, wanted to start their own country, and started some protests. Okay? All right, now Loyalists over here, these are people that were their neighbors, okay, people that lived in the 13 colonies as well. But these people have a very different idea of what they should be doing in the colonies, okay? So Loyalists liked the king. Loyalists liked the king. They thought that, you know what? Even if you don't always agree with him, he is our leader and we respect him. And he is a good leader. You know, you can disagree with him sometimes. But he is a good king and we like him. Good king. And because they liked the king, they wanted to remain part of England. Okay, so they believed that here in the colonies, they believed that yes, we are very far away from England and our king, but you know what? I think it's best if we stay. If we decide that we want to break off and be our own country, that's a lot of work. We have to have our own leader. We have to come up with money to build roads and to make an army and all these things. We already have all those things in England. So we just want to stay part of England. Okay? And sometimes these loyalists here, sometimes, not always, they sometimes left to go back to England. They said, you know what? We are so loyal to the king in England. You know what? Why are we even here? Let's go back. We'll go back and we can live in England. Okay, so sometimes these loyalists actually left the colonies and went back to England. That didn't happen all the time, but sometimes it did. Okay, so now we're going to talk about last today, the three things that are similar between these two groups. Okay, the first thing is obvious. They lived in the colonies. Oops, I don't know what happened there. They lived in the colonies. Okay, so both of these groups, Patriots and Loyalists, both lived here in the 13 colonies. Okay. Another thing that was similar, they both were harassed by the English army. There it is. Okay, so even though, so the Patriots, that kind of makes sense, right? The English army that's there kind of making sure everybody stays in line. You could think of them as kind of like the English police. Of course, they didn't like the Patriots, right? Because, you know, the English army, their boss was the king. And so if these Patriots say, hey, we hate the king, well, this English army is not going to like them, obviously, right? That makes sense. They wanted to be their own country. The English army did not like that. They started a lot of protests. The English army didn't like that. But even this loyalist group over here, who they liked the king, they wanted to be part of England, they still got harassed by the English army. The English army was not good to them. They were still very mean. They were abusive at times. They were just very... they just really abused their power in the colonies. And that really made a lot of people pretty mad on both sides, but the Loyalists still wanted to be part of England, still liked the king. Okay? And then the last one. Both groups tried to convince other people to join their side. Okay, so say that I'm a patriot. I'm somebody who lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and I really dislike that king. He is the worst. He is so terrible. He is so mean. He does not care about my family. He does not care about the colonies. I am going to go see if I can get my neighbors to agree with me and maybe join some protests with me. Okay. Same thing with the Loyalists. They were ones like, oh, no, hold on, neighbors, listen. You want to leave England? Well, listen to this. If we leave England, listen to all these bad things that will happen. Join us. Let's stay part of England. Yes, we're far away, but we should stay. Okay, so both sides were trying to convince people to join their side. All right, now, what we will do tomorrow, I'll jump over here to the agenda. So tomorrow is Friday. We will talk about the 7 Years' War, okay, the different sides of it. And believe it or not, both of these sides, the Patriots versus the Loyalists, fight on the same side. All right, so we'll talk about the 7 Years' War tomorrow and how these two groups kind of had to come together to help England in the war, in that war there. And we'll talk about those sides tomorrow, Friday, and go from there. We'll talk more in depth about that war starting next week. Okay? If you have any questions, office hours, 10:05.